The wagon seat was hard as a church pew and twice as unforgiving. Delilah Mercer shifted her weight for the 100th time in 2 hours, gripping the side rail as the wheels found another rut in the mountain road. The driver, a wiry old man named Cobb, who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and hadn't offered more than 4 words since Millhaven, kept his eyes forward and his mouth shut, which suited her just fine. She wasn't in the mood for conversation. She was barely in the mood for breathing. The leather satchel sat between her boots on the wagon floor. It wasn't much to look at. Dark brown, cracked along one strap. The brass buckle replaced twice with ones that didn't quite match. Her late husband Amos had carried it every single day for 14 years. Surveyors used them. Amos had said a man wasn't serious about his work unless he could carry everything important on one shoulder. After he died, she'd kept it not because she needed it, but because it was the one thing in the world that still smelled like him on cold mornings. She'd packed it with her good knife, a worn recipe book with half the pages water-stained, 2 changes of clothes, and $23, everything she owned that had any use. The road curved upward into the pines. Below, the valley floor stretched wide and gold in the late afternoon light, and from up here it almost looked peaceful. Almost looked like the kind of place a person could start over. Delilah had stopped believing in starting over somewhere around Ganton Creek. When the boarding house owner had looked her up and down, let out a slow breath through his nose, and said the position had already been filled, even though the sign in his window still read, "Cook Wanted." She'd stood there on his porch for a moment, her satchel in hand, watching his expression carefully. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something worse, dismissal. The particular blankness men wore when they'd already decided you weren't worth the effort of pretending. She'd thanked him with a voice that didn't shake and walked back down the road. She was good at that, keeping her voice steady when everything underneath it wasn't. 3 towns, 4 rejections. One particularly ugly afternoon in a dry goods store in Copperhead Falls, where 2 women had whispered loud enough to make sure she heard every word. Lord, who sent for her? The circus. And Delilah had stood there with her hand on a bolt of blue calico and decided, very quietly, that she was done with that particular part of the territory, which was how she'd ended up answering a handwritten notice pinned to a post office board in a town called Sutter Bend, small enough that it didn't appear on half the maps she'd seen. Cook needed. Hollow Ridge Ranch. 6 children. Hard work. No nonsense. Fair pay. No name. A rough map to follow, and a post office box number. She'd written a short letter. She was good at plain English. And 3 days later received a reply in handwriting that looked like it had been produced under some kind of duress. Come Thursday. Ask for Hale. That was all. No greeting. No, we look forward to meeting you or your qualifications sound promising. Just come Thursday and a man's name. She'd come. Cobb pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of a rise, and Delilah saw Hollow Ridge Ranch for the first time. It wasn't what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. Something more broken down, maybe, given the sparse language of that letter. Or something more impressive, given the elevation and the size of the land stretching out below. What she got was neither. The ranch sat in a natural bowl between 2 rocky ridgelines, sheltered from the worst of the mountain winds by a thick stand of spruce to the north. The main house was 2 stories, built solid from timber that had weathered to a deep gray, with a covered porch running along the front. There was a barn, large, in decent repair, and several outbuildings arranged with the practical efficiency of a working operation. Fences that had been mended more than once. A kitchen garden that had been planted but not kept up, the bean rows gone leggy, the herb patch half drowned in weeds. Somebody had cared about this place once. Somebody had stopped. End of my route, Cobb said, which was technically 2 words more than he'd offered in the past hour. Delilah climbed down from the wagon without help, landing heavily on the packed dirt and steadying herself. She was a big woman. She had always been a big woman, and she'd spent the first 30 years of her life apologizing for it before she'd gotten tired of apologies. Broad-shouldered, heavy-set, with strong hands that had kneaded bread and hauled water and helped birth 2 calves in her time. She stood 5'7" and carried herself straight, because her mother had told her that a woman who let her spine curve was a woman the world would walk on. She took her satchel from the wagon bed and stood looking at the ranch. "You know anything about the family, Well?" she asked Cobb. He was already turning the wagon. No, they keep to themselves. That's not a recommendation or a warning? He glanced back at her with watery blue eyes. Reckon it's both. Then he was gone, the wagon rattling back down the slope, and Delilah was alone with the wind and the sound of something, a crow, maybe, calling from the spruce trees. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the house. She heard them before she saw them. Not voices, exactly. More the quality of silence that children produce when they've been told to be quiet, but can't entirely help themselves. The shuffle of feet on a wooden floor, the particular creak of weight shifting near a window. She climbed the porch steps and knocked twice. Nothing for a moment. Then the door opened. The boy who opened it was maybe 15, lean and sharp-featured, with his father's jaw already visible in the set of it. Dark hair. Dark eyes that looked at her the way a judge looks at evidence, cataloging, sorting, deciding before she'd said a word. He was tall for his age and held himself like someone who had been the man of the house for longer than he should have been. Elias Hale, she guessed. Who's asking? Delilah Mercer. I wrote a letter. Your father wrote back. Elias looked at her for a long moment, at her size, at her satchel, at the road dust on her boots. His expression didn't change. Pause in the stable. He stepped back to let her in. It wasn't exactly a welcome. It was more like a door being opened for a draft that hadn't been invited. The front room was large and plain and almost painfully tidy, in the specific way that rooms get tidy when someone is trying very hard to hold something together. A stone fireplace. A table with 8 chairs, 2 of which had been pushed slightly back, as if whoever sat in them had left in a hurry, and no one had bothered to push them in since. A rug that had been beautiful once. On the mantel, a small framed photograph. A woman Delilah didn't look at too long. 5 more children materialized from the shadows of the hallway, ranging from what looked like 4 years old to perhaps 12. They stood in a loose cluster and stared at her with the unguarded intensity that only children and certain animals can sustain without embarrassment. The youngest one, a girl with tangled blonde hair and a smudge of something on her chin, was clutching a folded piece of paper against her chest like it was a shield. Delilah looked at the group of them. Well, she said, you're a quiet bunch. Nobody answered. That's fine, I can handle quiet. She set her satchel down near the door. Which one of you can show me the kitchen? A pause. Then the second youngest, a boy of about 7 with a gap-toothed mouth and ears slightly too large for his head, pointed down the hallway. Thank you, she said. What's your name? Jasper. Jasper. Good name, strong name. She picked up her satchel. Lead the way. The kitchen was the saddest room in the house. Not because it was dirty. It had been cleaned, recently and with effort, but because it was the kind of clean that's born from duty rather than love. The pots had been scoured but left on the shelf in no particular order. The spice jars were half empty and not labeled. The bread bin held a loaf that had gone hard 2 days ago. A sack of cornmeal sat on the floor instead of the shelf, and the shelf it should have been on had a crack running through the middle plank that nobody had gotten around to fixing. A kitchen told you everything about a household, in Delilah's experience. This one told her that meals had been made here out of grim necessity and eaten the same way, and that the idea of cooking as anything other than survival had been lost along with whoever used to make this room smell like something worth coming home to. She moved through it slowly, opening the cabinet doors one by one, checking the larder, lifting the lid on a pot that had been left soaking since the previous night. She found flour, cornmeal, a good quantity of dried beans, some salt pork, potatoes gone slightly soft, 2 jars of last year's preserves, cherry, she thought from the color, and a half-empty bottle of something amber she suspected was not apple cider. The garden she'd seen from the road was accessible through the back door. She stepped out and looked at it for a moment in the late light. The tomato plants were still alive, barely. Some of the herbs had gone to seed. The beans could be saved if someone got to them in the next day or 2. She went back inside and began building a fire in the cook stove. She heard him before she saw him too. Boots on the porch. Heavy, unhurried, with the particular weight of a man who had learned not to rush because rushing didn't change anything. The back door opened and Gideon Hale walked into his kitchen and stopped when he saw her. He was not what she'd built in her head. She had imagined something rougher, maybe. More neglected, the way the ranch had started to look. What she found instead was a man of perhaps 40, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who have worked hard physical labor their entire lives, and show it in their structure rather than their vanity. His face was weathered and angular, with 2 or 3 days of dark beard and eyes that were, she found herself noting this involuntarily, a particular shade of gray-green that she had no name for. There were lines at the corners of those eyes that had not been made entirely by sun. He was handsome, she supposed, in the blunt and accidental way of men who had never given it any thought. He was also looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, which was unusual. She could generally read people's expressions. "You're Delilah Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. You came earlier than I expected. Cobb drives fast when he's not talking, and he wasn't talking." Gideon looked at the cook stove, where she'd gotten a decent fire going. He looked at the cabinet doors she'd left open while she inventoried. He looked at her. "The pay is $7 a month," he said, "plus room and board. There's a small room at the back of the house. It's clean." "Your letter said 5. Something shifted behind his eyes. "I have 6 children and no cook. The market corrects itself." "All right." She turned back to the stove. "I'm making soup for supper. What time do you eat?" Another pause. She got the impression that this was a man who paused before he answered most things. Not from slowness, but from a deep-seated caution about committing himself to anything that might not be precisely true. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, she repeated. "Go wash up." He left without another word. She listened to his footsteps going back out the door and across the yard toward the stable, and she stood with her hand on the cook stove for a moment and just breathed. "Well," she thought, "you're here." Supper that first night was a study in silence. Not the easy silence of people comfortable with one another, but the loaded, fragile quiet of strangers sitting too close together around a table that held too many empty chairs. Delilah served the soup, potato and salt pork, thickened with a little cornmeal, seasoned better than anything that pot had likely seen in months, and set the breadbasket down and sat at the end of the table opposite Gideon. The children ate with the focused efficiency of people who had learned to clear their plates without comment. Nobody reached for seconds until Delilah nodded and said, "Go ahead." Then 3 of them went for the breadbasket at once, and the smallest girl, Lottie, she had learned, 4 years old, the one with the folded paper, knocked her spoon onto the floor and looked terrified about it. "No harm," Delilah said, getting up to retrieve it. "Spoons fall. Happens to everyone." Lottie watched her as she handed the spoon back. Those eyes, enormous and brown and absolutely unreadable in the specific way of young children who had learned early not to show too much. "Is your soup good?" Delilah asked her. A tiny nod. "Good. Tomorrow I'll make something different. What do you like?" Lottie's mouth opened, then closed. She looked sideways at Elias like she was checking whether an answer was permitted. "She likes cornbread," the gap-toothed boy Jasper offered, "with the crispy edges." "Then she'll have cornbread with the crispy edges," Delilah said. "What else?" Something shifted incrementally around the table. Not warmth exactly. More like a door opened a crack, with everybody peering through to see if what was on the other side was safe. Elias was the only one who didn't participate. He ate his soup and kept his eyes on the bowl and didn't look at her. When he'd finished, he pushed his chair back. "Elias," Gideon's voice was low, "I've got the evening chores. Sit." A beat. Elias sat, jaw tight. The meal ended without anything being said that mattered, but also without anything breaking. Delilah counted that as adequate for a first night, but she had trouble sleeping. The room at the back of the house was small and square with a single window that looked out toward the north ridgeline. The bed was narrow, but the mattress was reasonable, and there was a washstand with a chipped basin and a towel that had been left freshly folded on the stand, which meant someone had prepared for her, which meant she was at least expected, if not entirely welcomed. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch. The wind moved through the spruce trees in long, slow sighs. An owl called twice and then went quiet. One of the horses shifted in the stable. Somewhere in the house above her, she heard the uneven rhythm of small feet crossing a floor. Lottie, maybe, or one of the other young ones. She was used to lying awake. The first years after Amos died had been mostly sleepless, and she'd gotten acquainted with the hours between midnight and dawn in a way she would not have chosen for herself. 3 years now. She was mostly past the acute part of it, mostly past the reflex of reaching to the other side of the bed and finding nothing. But the nights were still long in ways the days weren't. She was thinking about Amos and about the sound of Lottie's startled face over the spoon when she noticed the light. It was subtle, barely a flicker against the window glass. She turned her head, and there it was, a faint orange glow moving slowly along the north ridge line. Not a lamp, not a campfire. Something held and carried. She watched it for a long moment. Whoever was holding it was up on the ridge, which was not the sort of place a person walked at night, unless they knew the terrain or didn't care whether they fell. The light paused, held still for long enough that she felt the hair on the back of her neck do something she didn't entirely appreciate. Then it moved on and was gone into the darkness. She lay still for a while after that, eyes on the window. Cobb said they keep to themselves, she thought. Didn't say anything about what keeps an eye on them. She didn't sleep until well past midnight, and when she did, it was with Amos's leather satchel on the floor beside her bed, within reach of her hand, the way she always kept it in houses she didn't know yet. The next 3 days established the shape of things. Delilah woke at 5, which was before anyone else, and had the stove lit and coffee on before the household began to stir. She learned their names and their habits systematically. Elias, 15, who did the morning barn work with a competence that suggested he'd been doing it since he was 12, and resented needing to. Nora, 12, quiet and precise and watchful, who helped in the house without being asked but never initiated conversation. The twins, Thomas and Aaron, 10, who talked constantly when they were together, and in nearly identical voices, making it briefly impossible to tell which name went to which boy, until she noticed Thomas had a small scar above his right eyebrow. Jasper, 7, gap-toothed and surprisingly cheerful, who asked approximately 40 questions per hour and had apparently decided that Delilah was interesting enough to follow around. And Lottie, 4, who communicated mostly in expression and gesture and who carried her folded paper everywhere she went. She learned the ranch's rhythms too. Gideon was up before her most mornings. She would find evidence of his presence in the kitchen without ever seeing him depart. A coffee cup rinsed and left on the shelf, the back door not quite fully latched. He spent his days in the fields or the stable and came in for meals and then went back out after dark. Not to the stable, she thought. She'd watched a few times from the window and he didn't always go in that direction. Sometimes he just stood in the yard in the darkness for a long time, face turned toward the spruce trees. She didn't ask about it. There was grief here, and she recognized its shape, having worn her own for long enough. You didn't push at another person's grief. You waited, and you fed them well, and you kept the fire going. The cooking she took seriously. On the second morning, she made the cornbread Jasper had requested, getting the edges right by letting the cast iron skillet preheat long enough that the batter spit when it hit. Lottie ate 2 pieces without being prompted, and looked at Delilah afterward with an expression that was still not exactly warmth, but was at least the possibility of it. On the third morning, Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30 and said, without preamble, "I can help if you want." "I want," Delilah said, without making it into anything larger than it was. Nora came in and they worked in silence for a while. The girl was capable. She knew where things were kept and she handled the heavier pots without complaint. At some point, Delilah showed her the trick of adding a small amount of vinegar to the biscuit dough to help it rise, and Nora watched with the quiet intensity of someone recording information for future use. "Did your mother teach you to cook?" Nora asked. "Some. I taught myself most of it. Necessity. Ma used to make everything from scratch." Nora's hand stilled briefly on the dough. "Everything." Sounds like she knew what she was doing. She did. A beat. "You're not bad." Delilah pressed her lips together to prevent a smile from becoming anything larger. High praise. Elias's hostility was a different matter. It wasn't loud. He didn't argue or challenge her directly, which almost would have been easier. What he did was subtler and more deliberate. He was unfailingly polite in a way that was clearly designed to communicate that she wasn't worth his anger. "Yes, ma'am, no." "No, ma'am." He passed dishes at the table when asked. He didn't sulk or perform. He simply treated her like a piece of furniture that had appeared in the house without his consent and which he was tolerating with the minimum required courtesy. She understood it. She was the woman eating meals at his mother's table, sleeping in his mother's house. He was 15 and had been holding himself rigid against whatever the world was going to take next. She wasn't going to be another thing he lost track of. On the fourth morning, she found him in the kitchen before anyone else was up. He was sitting at the table with a pencil and a ledger book, working through what looked like accounts, ranch income and expenditure, columns of numbers in his careful handwriting. She didn't say anything, just started the fire and put the coffee on. After a while, he said without looking up, "We're behind on the feed bill." "I know," she said. "How would you know that?" "Because the horses look thin and I found the invoice from Sutter Feed and Grain in the shelf by the door when I was looking for a cloth." She paused. "I wasn't prying. I was looking for a cloth." Elias looked at her then, a flat, measuring look. "Did you tell Pa?" "It's not mine to tell. It was in plain sight." He looked back at the ledger. "It's not as bad as it looks. If the cattle prices hold through fall, the bean harvest needs to happen," she said. "This week, before the rains come down from the north. I can't manage the fields myself, but if the younger ones help me after their lessons, we can get what's left of the garden in." She poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking if he wanted one and set one near him on the table. "It won't fix the feed bill, but it's food you don't have to buy." He looked at the mug. He looked at her. "The root cellar needs work too," he said finally. "There's a section of the wall that's starting to shift." "Show me after breakfast." Another pause, shorter this time. "All right." It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even close to friendship. But it was something. 2 people who were both trying to keep the same household alive, finding a narrow common ground. She took that. She could work with narrow. It was on the 6th night that she saw the light on the ridge again. She had not forgotten the first time, but she had been busy enough in the days between that she'd managed to bracket it. Frontier living produced lights in strange places, trappers, prospectors, wanderers of various kinds. The ridge was accessible, if not particularly easy. She told herself it was nothing. But this time the light stopped for longer than a lamp carried by a walking man should stop, and it was lower on the ridge than before, closer to the tree line at the edge of the ranch's north pasture. She watched it for 10 minutes from her window before it finally went on and disappeared. The next morning at breakfast she said, carefully, without alarm in her voice, "Does anyone use the north ridge at night? Trappers, maybe?" Gideon's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The children were quiet. Nora and Elias exchanged a look so brief she would have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. "Why?" Gideon said. "Saw a light up there, twice now." Gideon set his fork down. He looked at the table for a moment in a way that was not quite the same as looking at nothing. "It's nothing." "It's happened before?" "It's the frontier. People move through." "In the same direction, from the same point on the ridgeline, twice in a week?" His jaw tightened. "I said it's nothing." She looked at him steadily. She had been told in her life by many men that things were nothing in a way that clearly communicated they were something. She had learned that pressing too hard on those moments accomplished nothing, and waiting too long on them was worse. "All right," she said, and let it go. But she noticed after that Elias started coming in from the evening barn chores a few minutes earlier each night, and that there was a rifle, recently cleaned, so she could smell the oil, mounted in new brackets just inside the back door that had not been there when she arrived. She was elbow-deep in bread dough on a Tuesday morning when she heard the wagon. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front porch because something about the sound of it was purposeful rather than passing. It was a black-painted wagon with 2 good horses, newer and better kept than anything else she'd seen come up this road. And the man driving it wore his clothes like a statement. He was perhaps 55, broad and florid-faced, with a thick gray mustache, and the particular settled confidence of a man who had not been told no in long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like. He pulled the horses up in front of the porch and looked at Delilah with an expression that was entirely too familiar and entirely too pleased with itself. "Well," he said, "I heard Hale had hired himself some help. Didn't expect—" He paused, letting his eyes travel, and smiled the smile of a man who thought he was being charming. "This." "Can I help you?" Delilah asked. "Silas Crow. I run the cattle operation down the valley. Hale around?" I can let him know you're here. You do that, darling. She went inside without responding to the last two words, found Elias in the hall, told him quietly that there was a man named Crow out front, and watched the boy's face do something careful and closed and competent all at once. I'll get Pa, Elias said. She went back to the porch to wait. Crow was still sitting in his wagon, surveying the yard with the proprietary ease of a man measuring something he intends to own. You the cook? He asked. I am. Interesting. He tilted his head slightly. Where'd Hale find you? I found him, she said, through a posting. Crow seemed to find this amusing in a way she did not entirely understand. Hale's had some bad luck keeping on staff, he said. Cooks, hands, they don't tend to stay. Is that right? Rough country up here. Lonely. People find better situations. He looked at her directly and said it in a tone that was perfectly neutral and entirely deliberate. Things don't always work out. Gideon came around from the side of the house before she could respond. Not from the stable or the fields, but from somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't seen him go, which told her he'd been watching the approach of that wagon for longer than he'd let on. He came up onto the porch and stood beside her and looked at Crow with an expression that was like a door shut all the way and latched. Silas, he said. Gideon. Crow's voice shifted to something warmer, more collegial. Two men, business. Just came to say hello, checking on my neighbor. His eyes moved to Delilah and back. See, you've been making some changes. Is there something you need? Crow spread his hands, the gesture of a reasonable man with nothing to hide. Just neighborly conversation, though now that you mention it, I heard you might be looking to ease some of your burden. Land's a lot to manage for one man. He paused. My offer still stands. No. The word was flat and immediate and left no edges to get a grip on. Crow smiled. You know where I am? He gathered his reins. Welcome to the valley, Miss Mercer, she said. Miss Mercer. That smile again. Hope you find it agreeable. He turned his wagon and drove back down the road. Delilah stood on the porch beside Gideon and watched the black wagon go. Neither of them spoke for a moment. How long has he been trying to buy you out? She asked. Gideon was quiet for a beat. Since my wife died. She thought about that, about the precision of the timing, about the light on the ridge. He's not trying to buy you, she said. He's trying to break you first so he can buy you cheap. Gideon looked at her sidelong. He had the expression of someone who had known a thing for a long time, but found it startling to have it said out loud in plain language. I know, he said. Do you have allies in the valley? I did. Some of them stopped coming around. His jaw moved. People talk. What do they say? He didn't answer. She got the sense that what people said was the kind of thing he had decided not to repeat because repeating it gave it weight. They say I shouldn't be here, she said. It wasn't quite a question. They say whatever serves Crow's purposes, he said, which was an answer. She looked at the road where the wagon had gone. The dust was still settling in the late morning light, hanging in the air in the way of disturbances that haven't quite resolved themselves yet. All right, she said. She went back inside and finished her bread. 2 weeks in, she found Lottie's drawings. Not found exactly. Lottie showed her, which was different and more significant. The girl came to the kitchen one afternoon while Delilah was straining preserves and stood very close, which was her way of indicating she had something to say but hadn't committed to saying it yet. Delilah waited. She was getting good at waiting with this family. After a moment, Lottie unfolded the paper she always carried and held it out. It was a drawing in pencil of a house. A woman in the window. Stick figures in the yard that were clearly children. The proportions were entirely wrong in the way of 4-year-old drawings, but the effort was real. She'd pressed hard into the paper, and the lines had a kind of purposeful energy. This is your house? Delilah said. Lottie nodded. Who's in the window? A pause. Mama. Delilah looked at the small figure in the window, looked at Lottie's face. She's watching over the house, she said. That's a good place to keep her. Lottie took the drawing back, refolded it with the care of someone handling something important, and tucked it against her chest. Then she put her hand in Delilah's briefly and walked out. Delilah stood very still in the kitchen for a moment with the smell of hot fruit and sugar in the air. And she did not cry because she was not going to cry in this kitchen. in the middle of the afternoon. But she pressed her hand flat against the work table and breathed slowly until everything in her chest settled back into its proper place. You don't replace them, she had said to herself before she came here. You don't try to be something you're not. You just do what's in front of you. What was in front of her, apparently, was a 4-year-old with a pencil drawing and a grief she was slowly, carefully learning to carry alongside joy rather than instead of it. Delilah could work with that. She told Gideon about the ridge again on a Thursday evening. Not because she expected a different answer. She expected the same flat deflection. But because she had seen it a third time, and twice could be coincidence, and 3 times was someone making a choice. She found him in the stable, as she often found him in the evenings. He was working on a section of harness with a focused attention that she had come to recognize as his version of going somewhere else inside his head. He didn't stop when she came in, but he was aware of her. The horses were aware of her too. The big roan gelding turned his head and watched her with large, unhurried eyes. "Third time on the ridge," she said. He kept working. "I heard you. Same spot. Each time. North pasture corner, tree line edge. Whoever it is, they're watching the house. People watch the house. Gideon." She kept her voice level, not letting irritation into it. "I'm not a fool, and I'm not alarmed by the dark. I'm telling you that someone is deliberately and repeatedly watching your ranch from close range after nightfall, and that the man who stopped by last week to remind you that his offer still stands has a history of making people's situations," she used his word deliberately, "not work out." He finally stopped working. He set the harness down and turned and looked at her directly for possibly the first time since the evening she'd arrived, and she found she had to adjust slightly to the directness of it. "Crow has money and influence and half the valley in his pocket," he said. "I have 6 children and a damaged operation and enough reputation left to keep the bank from calling in my note. Barely." A beat. "What exactly is it you think I should do?" "I think you should start by deciding you're not alone," she said. "That's generally where it starts." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes in the lantern light were that unnamed gray-green again, and the lines around them were very clear. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. It wasn't an accusation, more like a statement of something he was trying to sort out. "I have." "Why aren't you gone yet? Half of them don't make it a week." She thought about Ganton Creek and the boarding house man and the women in the dry goods store. She thought about $23 in a cracked leather satchel and the long road that had ended here at the edge of someone else's grief. "Because I don't have anywhere better to be," she said, "and because this family needs somebody who isn't afraid of staying." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up the harness again. "I'll check the fence line in the north pasture tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. She turned to go. "Delilah." She stopped. "The older ones eat better," he said. "Since you came. Elias doesn't notice, but he finishes his plate now. He didn't before." She stood there in the stable doorway with the night air coming in cold from the mountains and the roan horse watching her with its patient dark eyes. "I noticed," she said. She went back to the house. Above the north ridge, the stars were out, and the darkness was complete and unreadable. And somewhere up in the spruce trees, an owl called once and went quiet, and Delilah Mercer walked back through the cold with her jaw set and her spine straight and her late husband's satchel on the chair beside her bed. And she thought, this is something worth staying for. She wasn't sure yet exactly what it was, but she was going to find out. The fence line in the north pasture told its own story. Gideon found it the morning after Delilah told him about the ridge. 2 posts pulled clean out of the ground, the wire coiled and left in a heap nearby. Not snapped, not worn through, but deliberately removed and set aside, which was worse than if it had been cut. Cutting could be weather or accident. Coiling took time and intention, and someone who wanted you to know the difference. He fixed it himself without saying anything to the children, which meant Elias found out anyway. Elias always found out, and appeared at the fence line with a second pair of pliers and worked the wire back into place with a silence that was full of things he was not saying. Delilah watched from the kitchen window when they came back in for breakfast. The 2 of them walked across the yard side by side without speaking, Gideon a full head taller, Elias matching his stride with the deliberate effort of a boy who was still growing into his own legs. There was something between them that was not comfortable exactly, but was functional. The way two people learn to carry a heavy object together without discussing how. You just find the weight distribution, and you hold. She had the eggs ready and the coffee hot, and she didn't ask about the fence because it wasn't the right moment, and she was learning that Gideon Hale operated almost entirely in the currency of right and wrong moments. After the younger children had eaten and scattered to their chores and lessons, Elias lingered. He poured himself a second cup of coffee. He'd started drinking it 2 days ago, which she suspected was less about the taste and more about declaring himself old enough, and stood by the window. "It's the third time this season," he said. "The fence." "Same section?" "Close to it. North corner where the pasture meets the tree line." She thought about the light on the ridge. The same location, every time. "Someone's been moving through there regularly," she said. "They know where the fence is. Pa knows who it is." "Yes. He just won't do anything about it." Elias's voice held a frustration that was particular to young men watching older ones absorb things they shouldn't have to absorb. "He just fixes the fence and doesn't say anything and goes back to the stable at night and—" He stopped, set his coffee mug down a little harder than he meant to. She gave it a moment. "He's not doing nothing," she said. "He's just not doing what you do. What I do would get results. Maybe. Or maybe it would get you exactly what Crow wants. An excuse." She looked at him directly. "A man who can show a judge that Gideon Hale threw the first punch doesn't need to do anything else. He just waits." Elias looked at her with that flat, measuring expression he'd worn since the first day. She had come to understand that when he looked at her like that, he was actually listening. "So what does Pa do instead?" he asked. "Right now?" "He holds on." She picked up the breakfast dishes. "That sounds like nothing." "It isn't." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and took his frustration back outside with him, which was the closest thing to conceding the point she was likely to get. She washed the dishes and watched the north ridgeline through the window above the sink and thought about Silas Crow and his expensive black wagon and the particular careful way he'd smiled at her. Things don't always work out. No, she thought. But they didn't always work out the way you planned either, and she had a feeling Crow was the kind of man who had underestimated the staying power of plain, stubborn people more than once. She dried her hands and went out to see about the garden. The town of Sutter Bend was 7 miles down the mountain road, which was too far to walk but close enough that a wagon trip was reasonable on supply days. Delilah made the first trip on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after arriving at Hollow Ridge, with Jasper and the twins, Thomas and Aaron, packed into the back of the smaller ranch wagon. Gideon had handed her a list and a leather purse without making eye contact, which she had interpreted as an acceptable version of trust. The town was not much. A main street with a feed store, a dry goods, a small hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a blacksmith, and a saloon that looked busier at 10 in the morning than she would have expected. The kind of town that had ambitions once and had settled into itself when they didn't materialize. She pulled the wagon up in front of the dry goods and climbed down, and that was when she first understood the particular texture of the problem. It wasn't immediate. It was the way a room changes temperature without anyone saying why. The woman behind the counter of the dry goods store, Mrs. Abbott, her name was, with a tight gray bun and the expression of someone perpetually deciding whether to be offended, looked at Delilah for a long beat before she said anything. A man browsing near the window glanced up and then away. 2 women near the fabric bolts at the back of the store leaned slightly toward each other. "Help you?" Mrs. Abbott said. "I have a list from the Hale Ranch," Delilah said. "Flour, salt, baking soda, lamp oil, sugar, and a length of that brown cotton in the window if you have enough." Mrs. Abbott took the list and began moving through the store. She didn't say anything objectionable. She was polite in the same surface-polished way of people who reserve their real opinions for when you've left the room. Delilah gathered what she needed and paid and loaded the wagon and was nearly done when one of the women from the back of the store passed her on the boardwalk outside. She was perhaps 45, wearing good clothes, not extravagant, but well-made, with a face that was attractive in a way that had clearly been managed carefully over many years. She looked at Delilah with a smile that was perfectly constructed. "You must be the woman Gideon Hale's taken on," she said. "I'm the cook," Delilah said. "Of course." The smile remained exactly the same, which was its own information. "I'm Adelaide Crow. My husband mentioned you." a pause so fine you almost couldn't hear the knife in it. I do hope you're finding the situation manageable. 6 children is quite a responsibility for someone in your position. I manage fine, Delilah said. Adelaide's eyes traveled over her in the same way her husband's had, that cataloging look. But where Silas Crow had been dismissive, Adelaide was calculating. Well, Gideon has had so much difficulty keeping staff. The last cook lasted, 8 days. Before that, a woman from Copperhead Falls. Lovely girl. Another pause. She left very quickly, said the situation wasn't appropriate. Adelaide tilted her head slightly. Living arrangements, you understand? Delilah understood precisely. I'm sure she had her reasons, she said. Of course. Adelaide put one gloved hand briefly on Delilah's arm in a gesture of solidarity that was nothing of the sort. I only mention it because the Valley can be particular about these arrangements. A single man, a widow. She said the word widow with a particular softness, like she was being careful with something fragile. People do talk. I'd hate for you to find yourself in an uncomfortable position. Jasper appeared at Delilah's elbow, holding a paper twist of hard candy he'd apparently negotiated at the dry goods counter. He looked up at Adelaide Crow with the uncomplicated directness of 7-year-olds. Who are you? He asked. Adelaide looked down at him with an expression that briefly showed something less composed. I'm Mrs. Crow, sweetheart. Oh, said Jasper. Pa says Mr. Crow is a... He stopped, apparently remembering something. A complicated man, he finished, in the tone of someone who had replaced a different word at the last second. Delilah put her hand on Jasper's shoulder. Get in the wagon, Jasper. She looked at Adelaide Crow evenly. Thank you for the welcome, she said. We'll see ourselves home. She got the children loaded and drove the wagon out of Sutter Bend without hurrying, because hurrying would look like something she didn't feel. And she did not feel like fleeing. She felt like a woman who had been told variations of the same message in so many different tones that she could identify the subnotes of it the way a musician identifies a chord. You don't belong here. Go. She'd heard it in every town for 2 years. She'd heard it in the boarding house in Ganton Creek and the dry goods store in Copperhead Falls, and the face of the woman who had said Lord, who sent for her, the circus in a voice just loud enough to carry. She'd heard it from people who meant to be kind and people who meant to be cruel, and she had learned that the intent didn't matter nearly as much as the effect, and that the effect was always the same. A door closing? One more narrow margin of the world from which she was edged. She was tired of it. But being tired of something and being defeated by it were two entirely different things, and she had been very clear with herself since Amos died about which of those she was willing to be. Miss Delilah? Said Thomas from the back of the wagon. Yes. Is that lady why people in town look at us funny? She kept her eyes on the road. Some of it. They looked at us before you came too, Aaron added. She thought about that. She's part of something bigger, she said finally. But it's not about you, and it's not about me, really. It's about your father's land. Pa's land is ours, Thomas said, with the simple territorial confidence of a 10-year-old. Yes, she said, it is. Don't forget that. Mets. She told Gideon about the conversation that evening, not because she thought he would be surprised, but because she thought he deserved to know she wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. They were on the porch after the children were in bed, the night air coming down cold and clean from the mountains, the first stars appearing in the gap between the spruce trees and the ridge. Gideon listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that was very still, like the stillness of water before something moves under it. When she finished, he said, Adelaide Crow has run 3 families out of this valley in the past 5 years. Just by talking? Just by talking. He looked at the dark tree line. Her husband does the harder things. She does the soft ones. Between the two of them, they don't leave much space. Have they done it to you? The soft things? He was quiet for a moment. After Martha died, there were suggestions that I wasn't managing, that the children needed a proper situation. He said the phrase with a faint, dry bitterness that told her it had been used against him more than once. There was talk of the county, someone checking on the household. Delilah felt something go tight in her chest. They threatened to take the children? Suggested. His jaw worked. Nothing formal. Crow has a particular skill for staying just this side of formal. He paused. When I hired you, there was more talk. A woman living on the premises, no family connection. He glanced at her sidelong. I should have warned you. It wouldn't have changed anything, she said. Might have prepared you. I've been prepared for that particular conversation since I was about 16, she said. It changes in the details, not much else. He looked at her. The gray-green eyes in the low light were impossible to read, which she had decided was less about him being closed and more about him being careful. A man who had shown too much at the wrong time and had spent years learning to correct for it. You could leave, he said, quietly. Crow would ease up. Adelaide would find something else to occupy herself. And your family would go back to that kitchen with the empty spice jars and the hard bread in the bin. He didn't answer. I'm not leaving, she said. I want to be clear about that, since apparently the Valley has been told I'm the type who does. She looked at him directly. I'm the type who stays. It's caused me trouble before, and it'll probably cause me trouble here. But I'm not made for going. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could have described precisely, but something that had been held tight there relaxed, just slightly, like a knot that has been worried at long enough to loosen a thread. All right, he said. They sat in silence for a while after that, which was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that settles between two people when they've arrived somewhere they didn't fully plan on. October came down from the mountains with its teeth showing. The mornings went cold enough to crack the water in the basin if you left it overnight, and Delilah added a third layer of wool to her morning routine and started the stove earlier and made the kind of breakfast that filled you up for the hard work ahead. Biscuits, gravy when there was dripping, eggs when the hens were cooperating, occasionally a pot of cornmeal mush with the last of the summer honey stirred in, which Lottie had decided was the finest thing in existence. The rhythm of the household had changed. She could feel it the way you feel the current shift in a river. Not loudly, not with announcement, but undeniably. Nora had taken over the bread-making 3 days a week, and she was good at it, precise and patient in a way that suggested she had her mother's hands. Jasper had appointed himself the morning egg collector and took the responsibility with the seriousness of a general managing supply lines. Even the twins had found their way into the kitchen orbit, Thomas obsessively interested in the mechanics of the cook stove's draft system. He'd explained it to her twice in detail, with the diagrams drawn in the margins of his lesson book. An errand useful with a peeling knife once you convinced him it wasn't beneath his dignity. Lottie had begun drawing at the kitchen table in the afternoon, spread out with her pencil and her papers while Delilah worked. She had produced in the past week a rendering of the rooster that was alarmingly accurate given her age, a portrait of Delilah that had her about twice as wide as she actually was, and wearing an expression of fierce concentration that was, if anything, spot on, and a complicated scene involving what appeared to be a battle between the tomato plants and a rabbit that had been based on an actual incident the week before. Is that me? Delilah had asked, pointing to the large figure in the portrait. Lottie had nodded. I look very serious. Lottie had considered this. Then she'd added, with careful, deliberate pencil strokes, a slight curve at the corners of the large figure's mouth. Better? Delilah had asked. Lottie had nodded again, with the satisfied air of an artist who has solved a problem. Okay. Elias had not transformed. He wasn't sullen anymore. Or rather, he was still occasionally sullen, but the sullenness was no longer specifically directed at her. It had become more generalized, the ordinary moodiness of a 15-year-old carrying responsibilities that would have bent an adult. He still called her ma'am rather than her name. He still held something back in every interaction, but he had started consulting her on practical matters, the garden, the food stores, the logistics of the household, with a directness that was its own form of respect. One evening, she found him doing his accounts again at the kitchen table, and this time when he said the numbers were tighter than he'd like, she sat down across from him and they went through the ledger together. He showed her what was owed and what was coming in and where the gaps were, and she listened and didn't flinch at the numbers and asked questions that were about understanding rather than judgment. When they were done, he closed the book and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Pa doesn't look at that book, he said. I know. He knows it's bad. He just doesn't want to see how bad. Sometimes people do that, she said, when something hurts. It doesn't help. No, it doesn't. He looked at the ledger. If we can get through winter with the cattle healthy, and if the spring prices hold, then you're all right. Maybe. He was quiet for a moment. You think it'll hold that long? Crow leaving us alone long enough to... I think that's what we're working toward, she said, making sure you can hold. Elias looked at her with the measuring expression, and this time something in it was different. Not warmer, exactly, but more settled. Like he'd run a test long enough to trust the results. You know what the other ones did? He said. The cooks that came before, the ones that left. What? They made themselves small. He said it flatly, like a statement of fact. They came in and they saw how bad it was and they started tiptoeing. Like if they didn't take up too much space, nothing would get worse. He shook his head slightly. It always got worse. She thought about Adelaide Crow on the boardwalk in Sutter Bend. People do talk. Taking up space has never been my problem, she said. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, briefly, before he shut it down the way teenagers shut down evidence of softness when they remember themselves. Yeah, he said. I noticed. The confrontation with Crow's man happened on a Friday in November, outside the feed store. She had gone into town alone. The children were at their lessons, and Gideon was with the cattle. To pick up a sack of cornmeal and to post a letter she'd written to a woman she'd known in Millhaven, the only friend she'd kept from before. She was loading the cornmeal into the wagon when she heard the voice. That the Hale wagon? She turned. There were two men leaning against the post outside the saloon across the street. She hadn't noticed them there, which meant they had noticed her first and waited. The one who had spoken was younger, perhaps 30, with the kind of physical size that some men wore like a uniform, broad, deliberately held, meant to take up the available space of a situation. He had a lazy smile, and he was looking at her the way certain men look at things they've decided aren't worth their respect. Something I can help you with? She said. He pushed off from the post and walked toward her with his thumbs in his belt, unhurried. Just making sure I'm reading this right. You're the one been cooking up at Hollow Ridge? I am. Huh. He looked her up and down with the exaggerated slowness of someone performing an assessment for an audience. His companion was watching from the post, grinning. Figured it had to be somebody who couldn't do better. She looked at him. She kept her face even. Is there something specific you need, or did you come over here just to hear yourself talk? The lazy smile spread. Come on now, I'm being friendly. He gestured loosely at the wagon. Hale running you into town for his errands now? That what your situation is up there? Widow woman living on a man's property, fetching and carrying. I'm employed, she said. Same as you, I expect. Though your employer keeps fancier company. Something flicked through his eyes, a recognition that she knew who sent him. Don't know what you mean, he said. I expect you don't. She picked up the last sack, which was 40 pounds, and swung it into the wagon bed without assistance because she had been handling 40-pound sacks since she was 12, and she was not going to fumble it in front of this man. I've got work to get back to. A big woman like you probably never had much trouble with the heavy work, he said, and the way he said big woman was designed to land a specific way. And it did land in the place where every similar comment had landed over 40 years of life, in the particular bruised spot that never fully hardened no matter how many times you told yourself it had. Must be nice, not having to worry about looking. Her name is Miss Mercer, said a voice. Elias came out of the feed store carrying a second bag she hadn't known he'd followed her to get. He was 15 and he was holding 40 pounds of grain, and he was looking at the man with his jaw set in an exact replica of his father's expression. The man with the lazy smile looked at Elias with mild surprise. Didn't see you there, boy. I noticed. Elias put the bag in the wagon and stood next to Delilah. He was not quite her height yet, but he held himself like he was. Her name is Miss Mercer. She cooks for my family, and she's worth 10 of whatever you're getting paid to stand in front of saloons and bother people. A silence stretched across the dusty street. Delilah put her hand briefly on Elias's arm, not stopping him, just acknowledging. She looked at the man. We'll be going now, she said. He looked between the two of them for a moment. The lazy smile was gone. In its place was something colder and more real. You're doing Hale no favors, lady, he said. Tell him that. I'll tell him you said hello, she said. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Elias climbed up beside her, which surprised her. He had his own horse tied at the post. He sat next to her on the wagon bench without explaining himself, and she didn't ask for an explanation, just clucked the horses forward and drove them down the main street of Sutter Bend at an easy pace, not fast, not slow. They were a mile out of town before either of them spoke. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He was looking at the road ahead. "You could have stayed in the feed store." "Could have." A beat. Didn't want to. She thought about the cooks who had made themselves small, who had tiptoed through this family's grief and then left when the cost got too clear. She thought about the spot in her chest where Big Woman had landed with its familiar dull weight, and about the way it had diminished a little. Not much, but a little, to when a 15-year-old boy had straightened his spine beside her and said her name like it meant something. "Elias," she said. "Ma'am." "Thank you." He didn't say anything for a moment. The wagon rattled up the mountain road, the horses working steadily into the grade. "Don't read into it," he said finally. But the corner of his mouth was doing that thing again, that almost not quite thing, and she looked back at the road so he could have the privacy of it. "Wouldn't dream of it," she said. Tut. By the time November settled in fully, the whispers in the valley had gotten specific. She heard about them through Nora, of all people, who had been at Sunday services in Sutter Bend with Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm, a tall, spare woman who had been the first neighbor to be genuinely civil and who seemed, as far as Delilah could assess, to occupy the narrow middle ground of someone who wanted to stay out of the Crow situation, but had a conscience that gave her trouble about it. Nora reported, with the flat precision she applied to most things, that she had overheard Mrs. Crow telling the minister's wife that Gideon Hale had hired a woman of uncertain background who had been turned away from several situations in the valley and was likely taking advantage of a man weakened by grief. The minister's wife had apparently listened attentively, which told you something about the minister's wife. Nora reported this at breakfast with the tone of someone presenting a mathematical proof, without visible emotion, and then looked at Delilah and waited. Delilah poured the coffee. "What do you think?" she asked. Nora considered it. "I think Mrs. Crow has never met anyone with uncertain background who worked as hard as you," she said, "and I think she's afraid of something." "People who make that kind of noise usually are," Delilah said. "What are they afraid of?" "Losing," Delilah said simply. "When you've spent years making sure someone is alone, the thing you're most afraid of is them finding out they're not." Nora absorbed this with the quiet depth of 12-year-old who processed most things twice. Then she picked up her fork and finished her breakfast. "I told Mrs. Patterson what she said wasn't true," Nora said. "About you." Delilah looked at her. "I told her you're not taking advantage of anything. I told her you fixed the bean harvest, and you saved the jar preserves, and you don't sleep past 5 in the morning, and the little ones eat better than they have since—" Nora stopped, steadied. "Since a long time." Delilah set down her coffee mug and put her hand on the table between them, close to Nora's. Not taking her hand, Nora was not a girl who invited easy physical comfort, and Delilah had learned to respect that. But close, present. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," said Nora, with an exactness that echoed her older brother's. "I wanted to." That was the thing about this family, Delilah was discovering. They were not warm in the easy and open way of families that had been unbroken. They were warm in the harder, quieter way of people who had been hurt enough that warmth cost them something real, and they spent it deliberately, in small, precise amounts, when they decided something was worth it. She was starting to understand that being decided worth it by the Hale children was not a small thing. Gideon found out about the confrontation at the feed store from his own source, she was never sure who, and he came to the kitchen that evening with a look she had not seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, but a contained version of it, the way a fire looks when it's been built into a tight space. "Webb," he said. "His name is Webb, Crow's foreman. The man outside the saloon. He had no call to speak to you that way." "He had every call Silas Crow is paying him for," she said. "That's how it works." "I'll deal with Webb." "Don't." She turned from the stove to face him. "That's exactly what they want. You go after Webb, Crow has a reason to escalate. You do something that can be seen and witnessed and discussed at Sunday services. I'm not going to stand by while— I know. She said it steadily. I know you're not. But I can take care of myself, Gideon. I have been for a long time. What I need from you is not to make it worse. He looked at her. The contained fire was still there, but something was working behind it. The careful calculation she'd come to recognize as how he processed things he didn't want to be rational about. Elias said you didn't flinch, he said. In front of Webb. I've had practice. He said you loaded the grain without any help. 40 pounds isn't much. A pause. He also said— Gideon stopped, looked somewhere past her shoulder for a moment. When he looked back, his voice was different, quieter. He said you treated him like he'd done something right. When he stood up. She looked at him. He did do something right. He's 15. He was braver in that moment than men twice his age. You should tell him that. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the gray-green eyes that held everything carefully, and this time what she saw in them was less readable than usual, layered in a way she didn't yet have the map for. I'm not good at that, he said, telling them things. I know, she said. You should try anyway. He left the kitchen without responding, but that night, she found out from Jasper the next morning, relayed with the breathless importance of significant news, Gideon had gone upstairs and sat on the edge of Elias's bed for 10 minutes. And Jasper hadn't been able to hear what was said, but Elias had come down to breakfast with his jaw slightly less set than usual, and had poured his coffee without commentary, and eaten a full plate for the second time that week. Small things. They were all small things. The corrected fence line, the ledger on the kitchen table, the 40 pounds swung without a fumble, the almost smile at the corner of a 15-year-old's mouth. She lay in her narrow bed that night and listened to the wind work through the spruce trees and thought about what Nora had said. The little ones eat better than they have since a long time. They had lost their mother and their warmth and their ease, and they were rebuilding it piece by piece in the only way families know how, through meals and mornings and showing up for each other when it cost something. She was not their mother. She was not trying to be. She was something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. She looked at the window. The ridge was dark, no light tonight. But the darkness had its own weight to it now. Watchful, held, the dark of something that had not decided to act yet but was counting the days until it did. She pulled her coat tighter and kept the fire going and told herself the same thing she told herself every night in this house. You don't have to know what comes next. You just have to be here when it does. The wind answered through the spruce trees with what might have been agreement or might have just been wind. Hollow Ridge settled into the cold November dark, and inside it 6 children slept a little more soundly than they had 3 weeks ago, and a widowed rancher stood in his stable turning a piece of worn harness over and over in his hands, and a woman with scars she hadn't shown anyone lay awake in a narrow room and held a cracked leather satchel and decided, for the 100th time, to stay. December came in mean, not the clean, quiet cold of early winter, but the kind that had teeth in it. Wind driving down off the high ridges with a persistence that found every gap in the house's weathered timbers and reminded you it knew exactly where you were. The ranch went into its winter rhythm. Shorter days, longer nights, the work compressed into the gray window of daylight between a late dawn and an early dark. Gideon and Elias spent the days checking cattle in the high pastures, moving the herd closer to the valley floor before the serious snow came, and came in at night with faces raw from the wind and a hunger that Delilah had learned to anticipate with the largest pots she could manage. She had started making soup on Sunday afternoons, big batches, enough to carry through Monday and Tuesday. And the smell of it had become the smell of those December evenings, salt pork and dried beans, onion when she had it, whatever root vegetables the cellar still held in reasonable condition. The twins had developed an uncanny ability to appear in the kitchen at the exact moment it was ready, which she suspected involved strategic positioning near the doorway rather than any supernatural intuition. The ranch felt different from when she had arrived. She noticed it in small accumulated ways that she didn't mention to anyone. The kitchen shelves were organized now, the spice jars labeled in Nora's careful hand. The bread bin held fresh bread 3 times a week. The cracked plank on the middle shelf had been replaced. Elias had done it one afternoon without being asked, without mentioning it, without any of the performance that would have made it into something other than what it was, which was a 15-year-old boy fixing a broken thing because it needed fixing. The children's lesson books were stacked on the table each morning instead of scattered, because Delilah had simply started stacking them, and after a week the habit had transplanted itself. Lottie had taken to sleeping with her growing collection of drawings tucked inside a cotton pillowcase she'd designated as their storage. Delilah had found her one morning carefully transferring them, smoothing each page before sliding it in, with the focused tenderness of a curator. The rooster portrait, now accompanied by a whole series, the horses, the barn from 3 different angles. A winter scene with Jasper and Aaron throwing snow that was more dynamically rendered than a 4-year-old's hands had any right to manage. "You're going to run out of pillowcase," Delilah had told her. Lottie had looked at the problem with appropriate gravity. Then she'd looked at Delilah with the expression that meant she had a solution she wasn't sure she was allowed to propose. "There's more cotton," Delilah had said. "In the dry goods box. We'll make you a proper folder." The expression on Lottie's face was not a smile exactly. It was bigger than a smile. The full-body version of it, the kind that starts in a child's chest and works outward until it reaches the hands and feet. She'd spent the rest of the afternoon drawing, and she'd produced by supper a portrait of Delilah that was still twice as wide as accurate, but was now smiling broadly, and had been given, in a clear act of artistic tribute, an absolutely magnificent hat. It was that portrait, folded and tucked carefully into the new cotton folder, that Lottie would later run back into the burning barn to save. But that came later. First came the escalation. Quote. The first sign was the cattle. Gideon found 6 of them gone from the high pasture on a Tuesday morning. Not dead, not scattered by weather or predator, but gone in the deliberate way that meant a gate had been opened by a hand that knew what it was doing. He and Elias spent the better part of 2 days tracking them through the snow and found 5 of the 6 in a draw 3 miles north, penned behind a temporary fence of cut timber that someone had assembled and then apparently abandoned. The 6th was never found. He came back from that search with something different in his face. Not the controlled anger she'd seen before. Something beneath that, something older and more tired. The expression of a man who has been absorbing measured doses of damage for long enough that each new one finds a body already compromised. He didn't eat much that night. He sat at the table and pushed food around, and the children were quiet. In the way they went quiet when they were reading The Room, and after supper he went out to the stable and didn't come back until after she'd checked that the younger children were in bed. She was still up, finishing the breakfast prep for the next morning, when he came through the back door. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, cold air coming in with him, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "Sit down," she said. "There's coffee." He sat. She poured. He held the mug in both hands and looked at the table. "I know it was Webb," he said. "Or someone Webb hired. Too clean for it to be casual." "I know. I want to ride to Crow's operation and make clear what happens if he—" "Gideon, I know what you're going to say." "Then let me say it anyway." She sat across from him, which was what she'd started doing when conversations needed to be direct. Sitting down, at the same level, no pretense of going about other business. "If you ride to Crow's operation, he's been waiting for it. He has men, and he has lawyers, and he has half the valley already told you're unstable with grief. You would walk into something he's already built. I can't keep—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I have 6 children. I have 20 years of work in this land. I have—" He set the mug down too hard, and coffee sloshed over the rim onto the table, and he stared at it. "I know," she said quietly. "They took a cow, Delilah. One animal I can't account for. Do you understand what that means for the numbers this winter?" She did understand. She'd been over the ledger with Elias. She knew exactly what the margin looked like. "Yes, and you're telling me to sit still. I'm telling you to be smarter than they are." She looked at him steadily. "Crow is trying to isolate you. That's the whole strategy, Tset. Keep you alone, keep you reactive, run down your resources until the only option is his offer. If you go to him angry and alone, you're giving him exactly the shape he's trying to cut you into. So what shape would you suggest instead?" His voice was tight, but he was listening. He was always listening when he sounded like he was arguing. "A different one," she said. "One he can't handle as easily." She had been thinking about this since the fall, since the fence line, since Adelaide Crow on the boardwalk. She had turned it over in her mind the way she turned dough, working it, looking for where it wanted to go. "You have neighbors," she said. "Real ones, not Crow's people. The ranchers on the other side of the valley. Harlan Peters, the Kowalski family, Mrs. Patterson. We're not close. Not anymore. Crow has been between you," she said. "I know. But being between people and having actually turned them against you are different things. Mrs. Patterson let Nora sit with her family at services for 3 weeks running. Harlan Peters stopped me on the road last month to ask after the family. These are not people who have decided against you. These are people who have been made cautious." She paused. "Caution is movable. Decided isn't." He was quiet. She watched him process it, watched the controlled anger move sideways and make room for something more considered. "What would you have me do?" he said. "Ride around the valley asking for help? Hail with his hat in his hand?" "Not asking for help," she said. "Offering it. There's a difference that matters." He looked at her. "You have strong cattle stock," she said. "You know the North Pastures better than anyone. Peters has been struggling with a water issue on his east boundary since summer. I heard him mention it to his son at the feed store. The Kowalski boy needs work, and you could use another hand through the winter." She kept her voice practical, because practical was what he could receive right now. "You build relationships where there are openings for them, not charity. Exchange. The kind of thing neighbors used to do before Crow started putting himself between everyone." Gideon looked at his coffee. He picked it up and drank and set it back down. "And that stops Crow." "It changes the calculation," she said. "A man who's isolated is a target. A man with allies is a problem." She met his eyes. "Right now you're isolated. You don't have to be." A long pause. The wind outside moved across the roof, and the stove ticked in the way stoves tick when they're working hard. And somewhere upstairs, Jasper was very evidently not asleep, producing the specific small sounds of a boy pretending to be asleep and making a reasonable effort of it. "You think Peters would talk to me," Gideon said. "I think he's been waiting for you to come to him for 2 years, she said. "I think a man who tips his hat to a stranger on the road is a man who doesn't like how things have gotten and doesn't know how to unstiffen them." Another long silence. Then Gideon pushed back from the table and stood, and she thought she'd pushed too far, too fast, and he was going to go back to the stable and disappear into whatever it was he went to the stable to do. But he didn't go to the back door. He stood at the table with both hands flat on the surface and looked at her. "All right," he said. She nodded, didn't make it into anything larger. "Tomorrow I'll ride to Peters," he said, after the cattle check. "Good." He looked at her for one more moment, that layered look she still didn't entirely have the map for. And then he went to the stable, and she finished the breakfast prep, and the house settled into the deep cold of a December night. He came back from Harlan Peters' farm the following afternoon with something different in how he carried himself. It was subtle, a degree or two of straightness in his spine that had been gone, a quality of his footstep that was less like a man moving through a space and more like a man who had somewhere to be. She noticed it and said nothing about it and put an extra biscuit on his plate. He told her about it that evening. Peters had been, his exact word, which she thought told you everything, relieved. He'd invited Gideon in without hesitation, put coffee on, spent 2 hours talking about water rights and cattle prices and the particular way the valley had changed in the past 5 years. He'd said, at some point in the middle of it, that he'd been meaning to ride up to Hollow Ridge for the better part of a year and had kept finding reasons not to. He said Crow had put it around that I'd become difficult, Gideon said, unreliable, that grief had changed me. Had it? He was quiet for a beat. "Yes," he said. "It had, but not the way Crow meant." "What way did Crow mean?" "Made me sound dangerous, unstable." He looked at the table. "I think people were giving me space they thought I needed and didn't realize they were leaving me alone." "How did Peters take it, the honest version?" "He said he'd known me for 20 years and had noticed I'd gone quiet and had taken that for wanting to be left alone." He paused. "He said he was sorry he hadn't come sooner." She looked at him. "Did you tell him about the fence?" "Yes." "The cattle?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Gideon's expression shifted. "He said it wasn't the first time something like that had happened in the valley. that the Garfield family, South End, had 3 calves go missing in the spring, that young Davis, East Side, had a water diversion cut on his property last summer that he couldn't prove wasn't natural. He looked at her. He said everyone assumed it was separate. Nobody connected it. She let that sit for a moment. Because nobody was talking to each other. Because nobody was talking to each other. She thought of Crow in his black wagon. The comfortable, settled confidence of a man who has arranged his world precisely because people in it aren't comparing notes. Then they need to start, she said. What? Gideon rode to 3 more farms in the following 2 weeks. He didn't announce this. He went in the mornings after the cattle check, came back by early afternoon, and was more forthcoming on those evenings than she had known him to be. She would find him in the kitchen before supper, not hiding in the stable, and they would talk over the day's progress, her at the stove, him at the table, the conversation running parallel to the cooking in a way that had become natural enough that neither of them remarked on it anymore. The Kowalski visit had gone well. Their eldest son, a young man of 20 named Pavel, who was methodical and strong and currently underemployed, came to Hollow Ridge 3 days later, and Gideon put him to work and paid him fairly, and there was a handshake that meant something beyond the immediate transaction. Mrs. Patterson came with Powell, uninvited but not unwelcome, and she and Delilah sat in the kitchen for an hour while she drank tea and said, with the directness of a woman who had made peace with her own opinions, that she was glad Gideon had found someone with sense, and that she hoped the valley was going to stop behaving as if it had forgotten itself. Adelaide Crow is not a stupid woman, Mrs. Patterson said, wrapping both hands around her mug. That's what makes her dangerous. She knows exactly which words go where. I know the type, Delilah said. She's been after Hollow Ridge land since before Martha passed. I think she had her eye on it as a summer property. Mrs. Patterson's mouth tightened slightly. Can you imagine? A summer property. What do most people think of her, honestly? Mrs. Patterson looked at her over the rim of her mug. Honestly? They smile at her and agree with her and then go home and make sure their own fences are locked. She set the mug down. The difference between people who are with someone and people who are afraid of them is a thin one from the outside. You have to look closely. That was the clearest thing anyone in the valley had said to Delilah since she arrived, and she stored it away carefully. Elias knew about all of it. He had known from the first Peter's visit, with the uncanny situational awareness she had noticed was simply how he was built. A boy who read rooms the way other people read words, automatically and continuously. He'd said nothing to the younger ones about it, which was its own form of protective management, and he'd started treating Pavel Kowalski with a careful, evaluating respect that suggested he was deciding whether the young man was worth investing in. She watched Elias make that evaluation over the course of 2 weeks and thought, not for the first time, that he was going to be formidable when he grew all the way into himself. He already mostly was. Done. Then Crow escalated. She came to understand it in stages. First was the water, in the 3rd week of December. The diverted creek that fed the South Trough had been dammed upstream, a simple rock and mud dam that took half a day's work to build and which had clearly been built by someone who knew the geography. Gideon and Pavel cleared it in a morning, but the cattle had gone 18 hours without adequate water in cold weather, which was a stress the herd didn't need. Second was the feed supply. The delivery from Sutter Feed and Grain, which came monthly and which Gideon had used for 6 years, was suddenly delayed. Then delayed again. When she went to the feed store in person and asked the owner, a nervous, apologetic man named Howell, who wouldn't quite meet her eyes, he told her there had been a problem with the order. Then, under some direct and patient questioning, admitted that he'd been advised that extending credit to Hollow Ridge might not be in his interest. Advised by who? She said. Howell looked at the counter. I have my own business to consider, Miss Mercer. She bought what she could pay for directly and drove home and told Gideon, and he was quiet for a long time in the way that was becoming familiar. The silence that meant he was measuring the pressure building against the restraint he'd chosen and finding the math increasingly difficult. He's cutting the supply lines, Gideon said. Yes. If we can't feed the herd through winter, I know. Peters has surplus feed, Elias said. He'd been at the table quiet enough that she'd half forgotten him. I heard him mention it to Powell. He overestimated his winter stock. Both she and Gideon looked at him. I can ask, Elias said. His voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone offering a thing they've decided not to be precious about. It's not charity. We can settle it in spring when the cattle prices come in. Yes, Gideon said. I'll ride tomorrow. She looked at Elias across the table, at the set of his jaw, and the particular competence in his eyes and the way he was, right now, the most immediately useful person in the room. And she thought about the boy who had opened the front door 3 months ago with the flat measuring expression of someone deciding in advance. He had decided. She wasn't entirely sure when or whether there had been a single moment or 100 small ones, but he had decided. Webb came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, not with Crow, not with ceremony, just Webb. Alone, riding a horse that was too good for a foreman's pay and wearing an expression that had left the lazy smile behind. He pulled up outside the fence line and sat his horse and looked at the house, and he was still there when Delilah came out onto the porch. Hale around? He said. What do you need? I'm talking to Hale. He's with the cattle. What do you need? Webb looked at her. That cold underneath the smile look she'd seen in Sutter Bend. You're still here, he said. It came out like a statement about something impossible. I am. Crow thought you'd have gone by now. Not a threat, more like genuine puzzlement, which was almost stranger. The other ones did. I'm not the other ones, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. It's going to get harder, he said. He wants that message delivered. It's going to get harder before it gets any other way. You want me to be scared, she said. I want you to be sensible. Give him my regards, she said, and tell him the feed issue didn't work. We have other suppliers. Webb looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not that cold assessment, but something closer to involuntary respect, the kind that comes through regardless of what you intend. He gathered his reins, turned his horse, and rode back down the slope without another word. She stood on the porch until he was gone, and then she went back inside and stood at the kitchen window and let out a long, slow breath. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the afterburn of holding herself that steady for that long. She went and made tea because it was something to do with the hands, and she sat with it until the shaking stopped. Gideon, when he came in an hour later, took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it, plainly, including the shaking hands, which she didn't see the value in omitting. He listened with that complete stillness, and then he looked at the table for a moment. He doesn't come on this property again, he said. No, she said. He probably won't need to. She was right. Crow had what he needed from the visit, she thought. He needed to know she'd been warned. He needed to know Gideon knew he'd been warned. The next move, whatever it was, would be something else. She didn't know then how much else. The storm came down from the north 3 days before Christmas. It announced itself 24 hours early with a change in the air pressure that the horses felt first. They were restless in the stable on the afternoon before, moving in their stalls with the low collective anxiety of animals that can read weather in their bones. Gideon moved the main herd to the near pasture and checked all the fencing twice, and Delilah spent the pre-storm afternoon making sure the house was stocked for 3 days without a town run. Lamp oil, firewood stacked inside, the root cellar checked, and the cellar door latch reinforced against wind. Elias helped her without being asked, working methodically through the list she'd written, and near the end of the afternoon he said, without preamble, "If it comes in bad, the north end of the barn roof is weak. Pa's been meaning to get to it since October." "How weak?" "Heavy snow load could stress it." He paused. "The main structure's fine, but the north extension, the storage part, I'm not sure." "Does your father know?" "I told him. He said he'd get to it." A beat that was not accusatory but was honest. He hasn't gotten to it. She filed this away, added check barn to her mental list, and finished the storm preparation. The storm arrived at 9 in the evening, and it meant everything it had promised. Wind hard enough to make the window glass flex. Snow coming horizontal in the lamplight from the porch. Temperature dropping fast toward the kind of cold that killed livestock and broke pipes, and reminded you that the frontier was not a place that could be made comfortable, only survived. She'd gotten the children settled, the little ones in the warmest room, extra quilts, the upstairs fire banked and checked. She was at the cook stove making the last round of hot milk when she heard it, a sound she did not immediately identify. Then she identified it, and she felt her whole chest compress. Not the wind, not the house settling, crackling. She was at the back door before the thought fully formed, and she had the door open and was on the porch, and the barn was on fire. Not the whole barn. Not yet. The north extension, exactly where Elias had said, but the fire had found the dry timber with an enthusiasm that said it had been given help. Through the snow and wind she could see the glow of it, already stronger than a few minutes old. The smoke was heavy and dark, which meant something was burning that shouldn't be, something beyond the structure itself. Lamp oil. Or worse. She was screaming Gideon's name before she'd made the decision to scream, and the door behind her crashed open, and Elias was there. Then Gideon, who had apparently heard it seconds before she had and was already in his boots, already moving. The next 10 minutes were the kind that compress in memory into a sequence of images rather than a continuous line. Gideon and Elias and Pavel, who had been sleeping in the bunkhouse and came running with a presence of mind that she would think about later and appreciate fully. The three of them with buckets in the wind and snow, attacking the fire from the east side where the wind wasn't feeding it. The horses got out first, Gideon leading them by hand while Elias handled the bucket line. She ran for more water, slipping in the snow, catching herself on the fence post, running again. She had made 3 trips when she turned back toward the house and saw the door standing open, and understood immediately, with a cold clarity that was nothing like cold, that the door had not been standing open when she came out. She counted heads, Jasper, Thomas, and Aaron, standing at the porch rail white-faced. Nora, Gideon at the barn, Elias at the bucket line, Pavel. Lottie was not on the porch. She didn't yell. There was no time for yelling. She ran. The north extension was fully involved now, but the main barn structure was still clear. The fire had been set at the far end and was working inward, not moving as fast as it might have because the wind was cross-directional, fighting itself. There was still a corridor, not much of one. Not for long. She hit the barn door, which was not fully latched, and was inside. The smoke was immediate and terrible, thick and low and moving, the kind of smoke that makes your eyes seal up and your lungs seize. She heard the horses. They'd been taken out. She knew they were out, but the sounds they'd made were still in the air somehow. She pulled the collar of her coat up over her nose and mouth, and she went in. "Lottie!" Her voice was swallowed by the roar of the fire in the far section, by the wind screaming through the gaps in the boards. "Lottie, answer me!" A sound, thin and choked. To her left, near the grain storage, near the wall where Lottie had helped her stack the summer supplies in October, where the child had spent an afternoon crawling through the grain sacks playing a game involving a very complicated kingdom ruled by mice. She went left. Lottie was crouched against the grain sacks with her cotton folder held against her chest, both arms wrapped around it, her small face buried in it. She was coughing, the thin, helpless cough of a child whose lungs were already compromised by smoke. And she was absolutely, completely unable to move, frozen in the way small children freeze when the world has become something too large and wrong to navigate. Delilah dropped to her knees in the straw beside her and put her hands on Lottie's face. "I've got you. I've got you, Lottie. Look at me." The brown eyes came up, enormous, streaming. "Keep the folder. Hold on to it. Hold on to me." She pulled the child up against her chest, wrapping her coat around her, and stood. Her lungs were bad. Her eyes were streaming. The north extension was, she could see it from here, coming through the interior wall now, the fire finding the connection between the two structures, and the roof above that section made a sound she did not want to interpret. She moved toward the door. 3 steps. 5. The smoke was denser at the level of her face than it had been 30 seconds ago. Her eyes were streaming badly enough that the door was a smear of slightly lighter dark in the dark, and she went toward it with Lottie locked against her chest. She heard Gideon say her name. He had come in behind her. She didn't know how far in, didn't know if he'd seen her, but she heard her name in his voice. Not a shout, something worse than a shout. The particular sound of a person saying a name because saying it is the only thing they can do. And she turned toward it and said, "Here, we're here." He was at the door. He could see her. He came 3 steps in, and his hand found her arm and Lottie simultaneously, and he took the child and he had his other hand on Delilah, and they were moving, and the roof of the north extension made the sound again, louder, and then they were through the door and in the snow, and the cold hit like something physical, something real and solid and survivable. The roof of the north extension came down, not all at once. A section of it, the central beam, collapsing inward with a sound that she felt more than heard. A concussive settling that sent a pulse of hot air and sparks out through the door they had just come through. She was on her knees in the snow. Lottie was in Gideon's arms, coughing and crying in the thin, exhausted way of children who have reached the far edge of themselves. Elias was there. Nora was there. And Nora had Lottie now and was walking her away from the barn. And Jasper was crying silently in a way she had never seen Jasper do anything. And the twins were holding each other with white hands. The bucket line was still working. Pavel and Gideon and Elias back at it within seconds, because the rest of the barn was still standing and could still be saved if they held the line. She knelt in the snow with her lungs full of what felt like broken glass and watched them work. After a while, she stopped coughing enough to breathe. The north extension was gone, an open frame of charred timbers steaming in the snow. But the main structure held. The horses, penned in the far pasture, were agitated but alive. The fire was out before midnight, beaten back by 3 sets of hands, and the snow that came down now in earnest, heavy and straight, the storm passing its own judgment on the night. Gideon came to where she was sitting on the fence rail when it was done. He had soot on his face and a burn on the back of his left hand that she would clean and wrap properly when they were inside. And he stood in front of her and looked at her the way a man looks at something he came very close to losing. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on the side of her face, just for a moment, rough and warm and careful all at once. And then he dropped it and looked at the ruined north extension, and his jaw moved. "It was set," he said. His voice was flat in the way of things compressed too tight to have any other quality. "Yes," she said, "the lamp oil smell. Someone poured it along the north wall." "Yes. That's not someone trying to scare us." He said it quietly. "That's someone trying to—" "I know," she said. The snow came down steady and cold and indifferent. The charred timbers hissed. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Lottie coughing, and Nora's voice, low and continuous, the way Nora talked to the younger ones when she was trying to hold something steady through sheer consistency of sound. Gideon looked at her. The gray-green eyes were very clear in the aftermath of the fire, lit by the residual glow and the snow's reflected light, and what was in them was not manageable or controlled or held back. It was right there on the surface, all of it, every bit he'd been carrying for 2 years and more. "She went back in for the drawings," he said. His voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically. A small, clean fracture. He repaired it immediately. "She went back in for—" "I know," Delilah said. "You didn't hesitate." "Neither did you." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind had gentled, the worst of the storm was past. The ranch was quiet in the particular quiet that follows catastrophe. Not peaceful, but emptied, like a room after a fight. "I was in the stable," he said, "when I smelled the smoke. And my first thought, before anything else, before the horses, before the barn—" He stopped. She waited. "My first thought was your name," he said. She looked at him. She was sitting on the fence rail with burned lungs and soot on her hands, and her coat smelling of smoke, and her heart doing something she was going to need time to process. And she looked at this man with his rough, careful hand and his fractured voice and his 6 children who were alive and intact in that house, and she felt something shift in the architecture of herself. Something load-bearing moving, settling into a different position. Not falling. Settling. "Go check on the children," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised, and not surprised. He held her gaze for another beat. Then he nodded, once, and walked toward the house. She sat on the fence rail in the snow for a little longer. The ruined north extension steamed and ticked. The main barn stood. The ranch was still here, damaged and smelling of smoke, but standing. "Crow wants to break you," she had told Gideon. She had believed it then as a strategic assessment. She believed it differently now. Personally, with the full weight of what it meant to sit in the snow with your lungs still burning, and understand that someone had decided your existence and the existence of this family was an inconvenience worth removing. She felt the anger of it, clean and clarifying. Not rage. Anger had more uses than rage did, if you held it right. She stood up from the fence rail. She went inside, and she cleaned the burn on Gideon's hand without being asked, and she checked Lottie's lungs and made her breathe steam from a pot of hot water. And she sat with the child until the coughing gentled, and Lottie fell asleep, still holding the cotton folder against her chest, the drawings inside undamaged, carried out of a burning building by a 4-year-old who had decided they were worth it. Delilah sat in the chair beside the child's bed and looked at the small sleeping face and felt the full reality of the night move through her all at once. The fear she hadn't let herself feel while it was happening, the relief that was almost too large to contain, and something else beneath those, something that had been building since the first morning in this kitchen with the empty spice jars and the hard bread in the bin. This family was hers to protect, not because she'd been hired to cook for them, not because she had nowhere else to go, because they were hers the way certain things become yours, not by ownership or claim, but by the simple fact of what you're willing to walk into a burning building to hold on to. She sat with that for a long time. Outside the window, the snow came down thick and quiet, covering the ruin of the north extension, covering the scorched ground, covering the evidence of what had been done and what had been survived. It made everything look clean and new, which was the particular cruelty and mercy of snow. It covered everything without distinguishing what deserved to be covered from what deserved to be seen. But she would see it. She had always been good at seeing what was actually there, underneath the surfaces other people managed. She saw it now clearly, in the light of a child's lamp in a room that smelled of smoke and sleep. This was not over. Crow had shown tonight what he was willing to do, and men who were willing to do this did not stop because it failed once. What had happened in the North Extension was not the end of something. It was the moment before everything changed. The morning after the fire, Hollow Ridge looked like something that had survived a war. The North Extension was a black skeleton against the white snow, charred beams jutting at angles. The floor a mess of ash that the overnight snowfall had partially covered without concealing. The smell reached the house every time the wind shifted, cold smoke and wet char, which is somehow worse than the smell of active fire because it has no urgency left in it, just damage. Gideon was out at first light assessing the ruin. Delilah watched him from the kitchen window, watched him walk the perimeter slowly, crouching at specific points along the north wall. She knew what he was finding. She put the coffee on and waited. Lottie woke with a cough that had loosened overnight but still worried her. Delilah sat with her through the first hour, making her drink warm water with the last of the honey stirred in, watching her color. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Lottie touched her chest, nodded once, small. "It'll hurt less by tomorrow," Delilah said. "Better still the day after." Lottie reached for the cotton folder on the pillow and pulled it onto her lap without opening it, just held it. "They're all there," Delilah said. "Nothing got damaged." Lottie looked at her with those enormous brown eyes doing something complicated, working through the previous night in the way small children process catastrophe, slowly and out of sequence. "You came," she said. Her voice was rough from the smoke. "Yes. I didn't want to leave them." "I know." Delilah looked at the child steadily. "Next time you leave the drawings. You hear me? They can be replaced." "You can't." Lottie considered this with apparent seriousness. Then she leaned sideways until her head rested against Delilah's arm, carefully, testing whether it was permitted. When it wasn't removed, she stayed there. Delilah sat very still and looked at the window and let the child sleep. Gideon came in from the ruin and stood in the kitchen doorway, and she saw his face and understood how it had gone before he spoke. 3 separate pour points, he said, along the north wall, inside the extension door, and at the connection to the main barn. Someone knew the structure. She poured his coffee and set it on the table. He sat but didn't pick it up. "Webb," he said. "He's ridden the fence lines enough times. Doesn't matter which one struck the match. Crow ordered it. Crow will have 3 men who can swear he was home all night." His voice was controlled the way things are controlled under considerable pressure. "I want to go to the sheriff." "Yes," she said. He seemed slightly surprised. She agreed. "Peters will back me. Between us, we have enough incidents to show a pattern: fence damage, diverted water, a missing cow, intimidated supply merchants, and an arson that nearly killed 2 people," she said. "Take it all. Take Elias with you. He should see how this is done." Gideon looked at her. You're not telling me to wait. I'm telling you to go in daylight with witnesses and put it on record. That's different from riding to his operation in fury. She met his eyes. Every time you do something in daylight, you shrink his room. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the ruined extension, visible past the corner of the house. Peters mentioned the Garfield family, he said. Missing calves in spring. And Davis, the water diversion. They should all file statements, she said. Together, the pattern is the point. He nodded. He stood, and she thought he was going to leave, but he stopped in the doorway. Elias told me what you did last night, he said, that you didn't hesitate. Neither did you. You went in first. He said it quietly, like he was still working out what to do with that fact. My first thought, when I smelled the smoke, before the horses, before the barn. He stopped. She waited. It was your name, he said. She looked at him. The kitchen was warm and the ruined barn was outside in the snow, and everything between them that had been building since October was right there on the surface, unhidden. Go check on Lottie, she said, then ride to Peters. He held her gaze for one more moment, then he went. He was gone most of the day, and she worked through it. She got the children fed and settled. Lottie stayed in bed as instructed, accepting this with little protest, which told Delilah she was more tired than she let on. The twins helped Pavel clear ash from the barn floor. Nora took the kitchen in the afternoon while Delilah walked the structure with Pavel, assessing what remained. The main barn was intact. The loss was the north extension, 30 feet of storage, the winter hay supply, several pieces of equipment. The hay was the most urgent problem. Without it, they were dependent on Peter's surplus through deep winter. Crow had known exactly where to hit. But the horses were unharmed. The family was unharmed. The drawings were unharmed. Those were the things that couldn't be replaced, and they were all still here. Mrs. Patterson arrived mid-afternoon without announcement, which was her method. She came with flour, lamp oil, 2 wool blankets, and a covered pot of beef stew that she placed on the stove with the air of someone who has done what they came to do and will not be argued with about it. She sat across from Delilah at the kitchen table and said plainly, I've been watching things in this valley for 2 years and telling myself it wasn't my business. I'm not proud of that. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Millicent Garfield will speak to the sheriff. I'll make sure of it. Thank you, Delilah said. Don't thank me. I'm 2 years late. She looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of someone checking work. Tell Gideon I'll send my boys with lumber next week. She left the same way she'd arrived, without ceremony, without waiting for a response. Delilah stood in the kitchen after she'd gone and felt something shift in the air, the way pressure shifts before weather changes. Not relief, something larger and less personal, like a tide turning. Gideon came back at dusk with Elias, and she could read it in how they both carried themselves before either spoke. Not triumphant, not defeated. The particular look of people who have done something necessary and don't yet know if it was enough. She fed them both and let the quiet work, and after the younger children were in bed, the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table. The sheriff listened, Gideon said. More than I expected. Peters was with me, and that mattered. He paused. He can't make arrests on what we have today. He said the pattern was notable, Elias added. He was watching Delilah. He said it like it might change. It will change, she said. If Garfield and Davis put their situations on record, the pattern becomes undeniable. A judge can do things a sheriff can't. Elias looked at the table. Crow won't wait for a judge. No. So we move faster, she looked at Gideon. Every practical connection you've built this fall, Peters, Kowalski, Davis, that's not just goodwill. That's the thing Crow doesn't have a strategy for. He spent years making sure you were alone. You're not alone anymore. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. I was wrong. About fighting with fury instead of unity. I knew it was wrong when you said it. I was too angry to admit it. She looked at him. You're admitting it now. I'm admitting it now, he said. Simply, without performance. Elias stood and took his mug to the shelf. I'm going to check the horses, he said, in the tone of a teenager accurately reading a room and removing himself from it. The back door opened and closed, and they were alone in the kitchen. She said what she had been carrying since before the fire, since the first weeks in this house when she had understood that staying was going to cost something real. "I have been turned away from more places than I can count," she said. "Not because my work was bad, because of how I look, because of how much space I take." She said it without apology. "I spent a long time believing that was information about me, that I was too much." She met his eyes. "I stopped believing it when Amos died. When you lose someone and you're still standing after, you understand that whatever you are, it's enough to carry." He was very still. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go, that was true, but I stayed because this family is worth staying for. I need you to know I understand the difference." He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face, and everything he had been managing carefully for months was simply there, present, unhidden. "You belong here," he said. 4 words, no ornamentation. From a man who chose his words with enough care that the ones he used meant exactly what they said. She had been told many things in her life. She had been told she was too much and not enough and unsuitable. She had been told she wasn't what people were looking for. She had never been told this, not in this particular plain, unadorned way. She held it for a moment before she answered, because some things deserve that. "I know," she said, not as someone receiving a gift, as someone confirming a truth she had been arriving at herself slowly through every morning in this kitchen. He nodded. Something settled between them, not resolved exactly, more like it found its correct position. "The barn," she said. "We take Mrs. Patterson's offer, Peter's lumber. We have it framed before March if the weather holds." "It won't hold," he said. "January will be bad. Then we frame it in March." "March," he agreed. They sat at the table a while longer, going through what was practical, because practical was what needed doing. Because two people built from the habit of work will often say the most important things through the medium of plans. It is its own language, and she was learning to hear it. The neighbors came the next day, and the day after that, not all at once, one at a time, quietly, with wagons and tools and the practical offerings of people who had decided to stop waiting. Peters with timber and 2 sons, the Kowalski family with more lumber and a collective efficiency that transformed the yard, Mrs. Patterson with Millicent Garfield, who shook Delilah's hand at the door and said without preamble that her husband had spoken to the sheriff with dates and specifics, and that she'd been angry about her missing calves since April and was glad to finally have somewhere to put it. Tom Davis came on the 3rd day, awkward with something he'd carried too long, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands until Gideon shook it, and then he looked like a man who had just set down a very heavy object. Delilah fed all of them, expanded the pot each morning based on who she expected, revised by noon based on who actually showed up. Nora worked beside her with reliable efficiency. Lottie recovered enough to come downstairs, set up her drawing operation at the kitchen table, and produced, over 2 days, a documentary record of the proceedings, portraits of arriving neighbors, a detailed study of Peter's eldest son's hat, and a sweeping composition of the yard full of people that had the chaotic energy of something true. Jasper appointed himself official greeter and explainer, meeting each wagon at the gate with a combination of welcome and information. She heard him telling Peter's son about the cornbread. "You want the crispy edges? I'll show you which piece," and kept her face turned toward the stove. At dinner on the 2nd evening, with the table extended by boards from the cellar and every chair occupied, the noise level was something Hollow Ridge had clearly not experienced in years. Peters and Pavel's father arguing about fence post technique. Davis talking cattle prices with Gideon. The children distributed among the adults with the comfortable ease of kids who have decided the company is safe. Lottie sat between Delilah and Mrs. Patterson, showing the cotton folder contents with the gravity of a curator presenting a collection. Mrs. Patterson examined each drawing with genuine attention, asking questions that Lottie answered in her quiet, precise way. "This one is Miss Delilah," Lottie said, producing the portrait. The wide, smiling figure with the magnificent hat. Mrs. Patterson looked at it, and then at Delilah. "That's very good," she said. And she meant the drawing, but she might have also meant something else, because she said it with a directness that went past the pencil work. "She gave me a hat," Delilah said. "You should have one," Lottie said, with the finality of an artist defending a choice. The table was loud and the food was mostly eaten and the fire was doing its job. and Delilah sat in the middle of it and felt the weight of 5 months settle into something different. Not lighter, more like it had found its proper distribution. Weight she'd been carrying alone spread across a table full of people who had decided, each in their own time, to show up. This was what she'd been trying to tell Gideon. Not the abstraction of community, but the specific, imperfect, slightly loud reality of people with different opinions about fence posts eating cornbread together in a house that used to be silent. It wasn't safe yet. Crow hadn't moved since the fire, and his stillness felt like something gathering. Peters had said it plainly that morning. He'll make one more push, that's how men like him work. And Gideon had said yes, he knew, and Peters had said then, we'll be ready. Ready looked like this, she thought. Imperfect and real and absolutely present. She caught Gideon's eye across the table. He was listening to Davis and Peters overlap each other in an argument he'd already heard both sides of, and he had the expression she'd seen more in the past 2 weeks than in the previous 4 months. The expression of a man who has found his way back to something he'd given up on. He looked at her, and something passed between them that was simple and clear. She looked back at her plate. Beside her, Lottie was drawing again. The new page showing the table full of people, slightly oversized figures, expressive faces, the whole scene tipped with enough chaos to be true. In the middle of it, already taking shape, was a large, smiling figure with a magnificent hat. Delilah looked at it for a moment. Then she put her arm briefly around Lottie's small shoulders and felt the child lean into it with the ease of something long since decided. Outside, the ranch sat in the deep winter dark. The burned north extension was already a frame of new timber rising from the ash. By spring, the hay would be restocked, and the herd would be through the worst of it, and the ledger would look better than it had in 2 years. And somewhere down the valley, Silas Crow was looking at what he had intended as a breaking point and watching it become something else. Watching the isolated man he'd spent years arranging become the center of something he hadn't planned for. That reckoning was coming. But tonight the table was full. And a woman who had arrived with a cracked leather satchel and the stubborn conviction that staying was worth the cost was sitting in the middle of all of it, and she was not moving, and she was not small, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Harlan Peters had been right. Men like Crow didn't go quietly. January passed in tense stillness. The ranch operated under a low continuous pressure that everyone felt and nobody named. Gideon checking fence lines each morning, Elias walking the property each evening before dark, Pavel staying on without being asked because he had the instincts of someone who understood when presence mattered. The waiting was its own kind of hard. Crow had been silent since the fire, and silence from a man like that didn't mean retreat. It meant calculation. Sheriff Cray came out in the second week of January to examine the burn site. He crouched at the pour points, said little, stood with his hands in his coat pockets when he was done. "I have 4 statements now," he said. "Yours, Peters, Garfield's, Davis's. The pattern is hard to ignore." "But," Gideon said, "but Crow has clean hands and good lawyers." Cray looked at the charred timber. "There's a circuit judge comes through in March, Heller. He doesn't owe Crow anything. I want you to hold until then." "I've been patient for 2 years. I know it. 2 more months." He rode back down the mountain, and Delilah brought Gideon his coat without comment, and they stood in the cold together looking at the framing of the new north extension. Pale timber rising against the gray sky, incomplete but rising. "He'll move before March," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." Crow's move came in early February, and it came as paperwork. A letter from a law office at the county seat, 3 pages of dense language claiming that a grazing rights agreement made 12 years prior gave Crow's cattle legal access to Hollow Ridge's north pasture during winter months, dated, witnessed, notarized. It looked legitimate. Delilah read it twice at the kitchen table while Gideon and Elias watched her. "This isn't about the grazing rights," she said. "He knows your operating budget. He knows the barn cost you. He knows the hay reserve is short." She set it down. "This is about forcing you to spend money you don't have defending against something manufactured." "Can we beat it?" Elias asked. The property description references a parcel absorbed into the county road allocation in 1887. The land doesn't exist in the form this agreement describes. She tapped the 3rd page. "Someone made a mistake or assumed we wouldn't look closely enough." "The witness signature," Elias said. He'd been reading while she spoke, quiet and thorough. He turned the page. Tom Howell. They all looked at the name. He knows something, Elias said. He signed something he didn't read, Delilah said, which is different and more useful. She went to see Howell herself on a Tuesday morning without telling Gideon in advance. She told him after, which she acknowledged to herself was asking forgiveness rather than permission, and which she also knew was correct. Gideon's presence would have made it a confrontation. She needed it to be a conversation. Howell was behind his counter. When she put the document in front of him with the witness signature facing up, his face went through several things quickly. "What did he tell you when he asked you to sign?" she said. He looked at the signature for a long time. That it was a routine property record, that it needed a community witness. He swallowed. "I didn't read it. Because you were afraid of him." He didn't deny it. "He does a lot of business in this valley. I have a family. I know." She gave it a moment. "Tom, this document makes a false claim about land that doesn't exist. Your signature puts you inside that, whether you knew it or not." She held his gaze. "You can let March come with your name on it, or you can speak to Cray today and explain that you signed in good faith without reading it. That's not a small thing. A judge can use that." He looked at his hands on the counter. Outside, the wind moved through Sutter Bend with its flat February indifference. He was not a bad man. She had never thought he was. He was a frightened one, and frightened was solvable if you made the solution feel safer than the fear. "Would it actually help?" he said. "It puts a crack in the foundation," she said. Cracks spread. He was quiet for a long time, then, "I'll go see Cray today, before I talk myself out of it." She drove back to Hollow Ridge with her hand steady on the reins and something clicking into place inside her chest. The feeling of a mechanism finding its final position. Gideon heard what she had done and said she should have told him. "If you'd been there, it would have been a confrontation," she said. "I needed it to be a conversation." "Was I wrong?" A pause. "No," he said. It cost him something. Not the admission she was right, but the admission that there were things she understood how to do that he didn't, and that was all right. That evening he came to find her on the porch, and they stood in the cold together, and he said the thing that had been building since October, since the stable and the ledger and the fire and every morning in between. "Stay," he said, not for the work, as—" He stopped. "I know what you mean," she said. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." He put his hand briefly against the side of her face, the same way he had the night of the fire. She put her hand over his and held it there. No ceremony, no perfect light. Two imperfect people in a cold yard with a hard spring ahead, and all of it, every complicated piece of it, worth it. March came, and with it Judge Heller. The circuit court met in the back room of the Sutter Bend Hotel, 8 rows of chairs, most of them full. Delilah sat with Gideon and Elias. Peters was there, the Kowalski family, Millicent Garfield, Tom Davis, Mrs. Patterson straight-backed in the second row wearing her good coat. Crow arrived with 2 lawyers and Webb, who sat at the back and looked at nothing in particular. Heller was efficient. He moved through the grazing rights claim, heard both sides, examined both property records, asked 2 questions, made a note. Then Howell came forward from the 3rd row and stated, in a voice that shook slightly but held, that he had signed the document without reading it based on Crow's representation that it was routine, and that he would not have signed it had he known its purpose. The room was very quiet. Then Cray presented the complaint summaries, dates, incidents, the pattern laid out in plain sequence without editorializing. He didn't need to editorialize. 4 ranchers, 4 separate incidents, 1 consistent direction of pressure, 1 consistent beneficiary. Crow's lawyer made his argument. He made it well, with the fluency of someone who had prevailed in similar rooms before. Heller listened. He wrote something. He put his pen down. "Mr. Crow." Crow stood, still broad, still settled, still carrying himself with the ease of a man who expected to remain the largest force in any room. "The grazing rights claim is dismissed," Heller said. "The property does not exist in the form described. The document is invalid." He paused, and his voice did not change in volume, but changed in weight. "I am referring the matter of the barn fire and related incidents to the county prosecutor's office with my recommendation that a formal investigation be opened. Sheriff Cray will provide full cooperation." He looked at Crow directly. I would strongly advise you to retain your lawyers for a different matter than the one you came here with today. The room was still. Crow's face didn't collapse. He was too composed for that. But something left it. The settled certainty, the proprietary ease, and what remained was just a man, older than he appeared from a distance, standing in a room full of people who had stopped looking away. He sat down without speaking. It was done in under 2 hours. Outside in the cold March air, the valley's ranchers stood together and absorbed what had happened. Peter shook Gideon's hand. Millicent Garfield held her husband briefly and fiercely. Tom Davis stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the street like a man who had carried something for 9 months and just put it down. Mrs. Patterson came to stand beside Delilah. "It's not finished," she said. "The investigation could take time. Crow has money." "Yes," Delilah said, "but it's different now." He came into this room expecting the same room he's always walked into. She looked at the ranchers talking in the street. "It wasn't." "That's everyone's doing," Delilah said. "Don't be modest. It doesn't suit you." Mrs. Patterson said it without cruelty. "You showed up and you didn't leave. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone who refuses to go." Delilah thought about the post office board in Sutter Bend. "Come Thursday. Ask for Hale." The cracked satchel. $23. The boarding house man and the women in the dry goods store and the long road that had ended improbably here. "I didn't have anywhere better to be," she said. Mrs. Patterson looked at her with something that was close to affection. "I suspect you had exactly where you needed to be," she said. Lottie was on the porch when they came home. She came down the steps without hesitation and put her hand in Delilah's, the way she did now without preamble, without checking first whether it was permitted. "Is it okay?" she asked. "It's okay," Delilah said. Lottie held up the cotton folder. Inside was a new drawing, all 8 of them in a line, rendered in her particular style. Gideon on the left. The 6 children in the middle. And on the right, large and smiling and wearing the magnificent hat she always gave her, the figure that was unmistakably Delilah. Not the hired cook, not the stranger from the road. Part of the line. Just there, where she belonged. Delilah looked at it for a long moment and felt the full weight of the past 5 months move through her. Not painfully, just fully, the way you feel a thing when it has finally resolved into something you can hold. "It's perfect," she told Lottie. That night, after the children were in bed, Gideon found her on the front porch. She was sitting on the top step with Amos's leather satchel in her lap, not holding it like a lifeline anymore, just holding it the way you hold something that belongs to the past, with the knowledge that the past is not gone, but is also not where you are. He sat beside her. The night was cold and clear, the ridge dark and quiet. No light up there tonight, just stars and wind and the sound of a place that had come through something. "What's in it?" he asked. "First time in 5 months. "My recipe book, 2 changes of clothes, a good knife." She paused. "Amos's surveying compass. I kept it because—" She stopped. "I don't entirely know why I kept it." "Because he would have wanted you to have it," Gideon said. She looked at him, at the gray-green eyes and the healed burn scar and the worn face of a man who had been shaped by loss and had come through the other side of it still standing, still willing. "I used to carry everything I owned in this bag," she said. "Figured if it fit in one bag, I could always move. Couldn't be caught without a way out. And now?" She set the satchel down beside her on the step instead of in her lap. "Now I think I could unpack," she said. He found her hand on the step. Not dramatically. Just found it, the way things find their place when you stop moving long enough for them to settle. She held on. The valley below was dark and changed. Not transformed, just changed, the way things change when enough people decide to stop looking away. Crow was still down there, adjusting to a smaller room than he'd planned on. The investigation would take time. The North Extension still needed 3 weeks of work. The spring ledger would require careful management. None of it was finished. But Elias was sleeping without his jaw clenched for the first time in months. Lottie had a cotton folder full of drawings that had been carried out of a fire and were now safe. Nora was coming into herself in ways that were sharp and real. Jasper had opinions about cornbread that he delivered with absolute authority. The twins were arguing productively about water engineering. A family that had learned to survive without warmth was remembering what warmth felt like. And a woman who had been told for 40 years that she was too much, too big, too stubborn, too present, was sitting on a porch step in the cold with her hand in another person's hand and her bag set down beside her, not in her lap, not within reaching distance for a quick departure, just beside her. Where things go when you've decided to stay. She had arrived at Hollow Ridge with scars she hadn't shown anyone, and the fixed, unreasonable conviction that staying was worth more than being comfortable. She had been right, not because everything worked out cleanly. It hadn't and wouldn't. But because the people who needed someone to stay had needed it genuinely, and she had been the one willing to pay that cost, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The stars moved in their slow arc overhead, and Hollow Ridge held all of them in the cold and the quiet. And the valley below it was different than it had been in September. Not fixed, not perfect, just different. Changed by the simplest and most stubborn act available to any person in any place. She had come. She had stayed. She had refused, against every reasonable expectation, to be moved. And the place where she finally put her bag down had turned out to be home.